Okay, so welcome back to part two, where, as I said, I will talk to you more about the whole theme of enemies and opposition, which developed as I came to study this from the book of Nehemiah. But what I haven't done so far is tell you a bit about the ending of the book of Nehemiah, which I better do. At some point, Nehemiah actually goes back to Susa to report to the king. Now, it mentions it clearly in the text. It doesn't say exactly when he went. It doesn't say how long he was away for, or indeed what brought him back again, because I don't think he got news this time that there was a problem. So whether he just felt, I've got to report back to the king, after all he let me go, he provided all this material and so on, I better go and tell him that it's all been really good and so on. But eventually he comes back and he finds that things have gone horribly wrong. And chapter 13 is one of those parts of scripture that you sort of wish wasn't there. Why can't it have ended with the big celebration of the wall, the rebuilding of the people, and all the city working well again? Why did it all go badly wrong? And one of the things that we find went wrong is that one of these enemies, Tobiah, has now sort of checked in to some of the rooms in the temple. And if you remember, being, get the right way around, he was the Moabite, I think, he wasn't allowed anywhere near that. He shouldn't have been there at all. But he was let in by the priest, Eliashib, who basically said, yeah, you can have these rooms for your own benefit and so on. And he was therefore taking stuff away from the priests and so on. So the enemy had really got inside, really infiltrated. It's as though Nehemiah somehow hadn't set enough in safeguards in process so that when he left for a while, things could be okay. And when he comes back, he finds everything has gone wrong in terms of intermarriage, in terms of keeping the Sabbath and so on. All the things that in chapter 10 the Israelites had vowed that they would do or not do, having been taught the law, he comes back and he finds that they're doing it. And at the end of chapter 10, part of their vow was, we will not neglect the house of our God. They all signed up to that. In chapter 13, when he comes back, he has to ask in verse 11, why is the house of God neglected? And so it ends with great disappointment. It ends with Nehemiah actually, if you read it carefully, beating people up and pulling out hair, which is why this is perhaps not the best sort of model for leadership. It doesn't get into the modern sort of courses today for how to be a good church leader, that bit. But as always, he was zealous and passionate and wanted to put things right. But what a disappointment, what an anticlimax after all the work that they had done and all the promises that they had made and so on. And when I thought about that, I realised that firstly, that doesn't in any way discount all the stuff that they'd done. The wall that they built, the reforming that they'd done and so on. So let's not get too down about it. But do you remember that I said that this was the very last part of Scripture before the big silence of 400 years, before John the Baptist and Jesus? What is it actually pointing to? I think it's pointing to the fact that in the end, no amount of human effort can ever put people fully right with God. Not even long reading of the Bible, if you like. No amount of reforms, no amount of good leadership. We should never put our trust in men and what they can do. It leaves us hanging, waiting for Messiah, because that's what the Jews needed still. Effectively, Nehemiah repeats the pattern of their history, which had been, yes, things get good for a while and then it goes again. So they have a good king, a bad king. They have some period of revival, then they're back to doing their own thing again. Nehemiah fits the pattern of Israel's history and of their continual failure and so on, because they still hadn't yet got their Messiah. And I think that's a big lesson for us as we go through what I've got today, that ultimately Nehemiah has to point to Christ, or at least for Israel to their Messiah, that they were still waiting for at that point. If Nehemiah had ended in complete success, we'd all be saying, let's do it the Nehemiah way. But it didn't work out that way. And we know that no human leader can ever replace the work of God in that sense. We need Christ as much as they did, and we always will. So the fact that the book ends in this strange sort of way, I think, is important. It leaves us with hope. It leaves us with lots of lessons to learn, but it doesn't mean that's the way to solve all the problems. We need to bear that in mind when we think about, this leader's going to change everything for us. The other thing about it is that why were they rebuilding Jerusalem at all? Why did they think that this was important? Well, for them, it was important to have a city, a capital, a place where, for a start, they could go in and be defended if they were attacked. And as I said before, a place that represented what they were about and their God, so they weren't in trouble and disgrace. But if you think about it, they weren't just reconnecting with their past and making a new start for themselves. They didn't realise it at the time, but they were starting to prepare a city in readiness for the Messiah, a place where God's Son would eventually come to teach, to die, and to deal with those issues of rebellion and disobedience which they couldn't solve themselves. And this is the bigger purpose behind all their efforts. So I think we need to ask sometimes when we're doing something for God, why are we doing these things? What's the bigger picture? It's not just for ourselves or for whatever we're doing. Is it so that Jesus can come into our midst? Is it so that he can come to teach, to heal, and to be worshipped? Are we building something bigger in readiness for his return to planet Earth? And I don't mean, of course, we can put it all right before he comes. I'm not saying that at all. But everything that the Israelites were doing in the book of Nehemiah, in that period of history, they were actually doing it for Jesus' sake. They just didn't know it. But we should also bear that in mind, because we do know that he's been and that he's coming back. So we can have that bigger perspective. So that's what I get out of the very end of it. Now, this theme of enemies and opposition. So I've given you a pretty good overview, I think, in the book of Nehemiah, particularly in the first 6 chapters, of the sort of things that occurred: the mocking, the ridicule, the plotting, the desire to physically kill, and so on. We could summarise it by saying there's 4 main kinds of opposition. There was personal to Nehemiah, there was corporate to the whole of Israel, the Jewish people, there was internal opposition and external opposition. That's how it seems to be categorised. So some was personal and individual to Nehemiah himself. Let's attack him, let's discredit him, let's make him be sort of down in the eyes of his own people. Some involved a more corporate attack on the people of Israel as a whole. Some came from ancient enemies, people outside of Israel, and some of it came about through the internal strife that they had amongst themselves. And then, as I just said, there's the problem in the end of one of the external enemies becoming internal, getting into the very heart of their community and their religious life. I think it's worth adding that, as I said before, you get mocked, you get ridiculed and so on, and some of you have experienced that, probably will. Do you ever see that in a positive light? Do you ever realise it's a sign that you're doing the right thing? And the enemy's getting worried? So if persecution increases, take heart. You must be doing something that's pleasing God. If our enemies leave us alone, that's probably the time to actually question whether we're doing what God really wants. So bear that in mind, and do what Nehemiah did, sort of pray and carry on. You can do your own T-shirt on that one. Now, at the mid part of the book, once we get to chapter 7, so the wall's completed and so on, chapter 7 and verse 1 is where we pick up the main idea of this. After the wall had been rebuilt and I had set the doors in place, so now we've moved on a stage from just having all the stones in place. Now the gates have been rebuilt with the fresh wood that was brought, because that had been burnt, so they couldn't reuse that. Nehemiah then starts to appoint certain people. And he says that he appointed gatekeepers, singers, and Levites. And then he actually puts in charge of Jerusalem his brother Hanani, along with Hananiah, the commander of the citadel, because he was a man of integrity and feared God more than most men do. Now, this is where we think Hanani might have been his actual brother, unless he just means, say, a fellow Israelite. But he appointed, in particular, as well as obviously singers, Levites, so people to praise God, worship leaders, if you like, Levites to teach and help people understand the word, alongside Ezra. He appointed gatekeepers. And I'm going to talk now about what I call guards and gatekeepers. We could use the word watchman if we like on this, but I like the word guard because it begins with G, like gatekeepers. So allow me that little thing. So he appointed people, basically, this is verse 3. Actually, it does say guards in verse 3. While the gatekeepers are still on duty, make them shut the doors and bar them. Also appoint residents of Jerusalem as guards, some at their own posts and some near their own houses. Okay, so guards and gatekeepers. There's a lot to these two particular roles, and in particular, we can all be part of what is needed here. We can all be guards or watchmen, but as I'm going to say in a few minutes, gatekeepers are more significant, and we need to make sure the right people are gatekeepers. It's impossible to underestimate the crucial nature of the gates of a city. You've probably read about this in your Bible reading, what happened at gates, how significant they are. A city obviously needs gates, otherwise it's a prison. Gates are the only gaps in a wall that's allowed, but it makes them danger points. And they're danger points if they're left unmonitored. Who or what is permitted to go through the gates determines the success and safety of the city. Gatekeepers are essential. But equally, there's another role, these guards or watchmen, that Nehemiah thought was equally important, that the residents of the city themselves, anyone and everyone, should take on that responsibility of being, if you like, a guard duty. And notice that they were appointed, some at their posts, some near their own houses, which, if you remember, was where they built the wall themselves. So it's a little bit like, you've built this bit, now you look after it, or you look over it. Keep an eye on it. So what was a guard or a watchman of the wall expected to do? Well, obviously be on the lookout for approaching enemies. Go up on the top, scan the horizon, look for the clouds of dust as the attackers are on their way, in order to avoid the element of surprise. The second part of the task would be to keep an eye on the wall itself. Are there any loose stones? Any cracks appearing? Is there a bit of repair needed here and there? We built it, it's strong, but walls don't look after themselves, do they? Buildings don't look after themselves. Have you noticed that? People need to keep an eye on things, and they need maintenance if they're to remain strong. And it really is not a good idea to wait until the enemy is just round the corner and then do a quick patch-up job to see if that will work. So walls need watchmen or guards to look out for enemies, but also to check up on the strength and security of the wall. Who qualified for that? Anyone. Everyone. These were the ordinary residents of the city that had taken part in the rebuilding, and they can all help in keeping it strong, particularly if it's the bit near their own home. Now, when applying that to us and saying that we are the wall, as in we are the living stones, we are the community of God's people, then we need looking after. We need watching over. We need people to keep an eye on us to make sure that we are still strong and that we're not going astray, and so on. Whose responsibility is that? It's all of us. We are all called to look after each other and not just load the whole responsibility up to some sort of deacon, elder, pastor or leader. We're all meant to take part in that, to keep an eye on each other as living stones within the Christian community. Because we need to get to know each other. We need to be in relationship with each other so that we can spot if anything is going wrong. Is anyone becoming a bit cracked or loose, even detached? What's happening in their lives? Are they falling apart? Have they gone missing in some way? And the role of a watchman here with each other is to simply ask questions of people. How are you doing? How are things going? We haven't seen you around recently. You're looking a bit stressed. Is everything okay? It's just caring for people. It's loving one another, isn't it? Isn't that the idea? And the other aspect of watching over people, which we can all do, is to see if they are coming under the attack of the enemy at any particular time. And of course, for that, we need to be strong ourselves, which I'll say more about later. But as guards of our particular wall, as watchmen and women, don't forget, we should be strengthening and repairing each other where necessary, but warning of other dangers, because people do go astray, they do get tempted, they do get complacent at times. And we should be watching over each other, watching for the signs and being prepared to say, should you be doing that? Should you be talking like that, do you think? Should you be going there? And so on. Someone once said, reluctance to challenge each other makes us vulnerable to the enemy's attack. I heard that from a friend, and he didn't know that I was thinking about this. But I thought it was a very powerful and very wise statement. We probably think, I can't say anything, or I don't want to be involved, and that sort of thing. But the reluctance to challenge each other when necessary, and in a loving way, obviously, makes us more vulnerable to the attacks of the enemy. Now, many of you probably travel on the tube, as I do, when I come into London, and you've probably therefore heard that rather annoying recorded message that tells people to keep an eye out for anything suspicious and report it. Have you come across that? And at the end, there's this memorable slogan, isn't there? See it, say it, sorted. Exactly. The implication being that just seeing it's not enough. You've got to say something and then it gets sorted. So I think it's a bit of a motto for us, really. Keep looking, and when you see something, say it, and then it might get sorted. I think there's a notice on your boards there about it's about maintenance in the building. That if you don't report the problem, it won't get fixed, or something. Same sort of idea. One person cannot look after everyone, but if everyone looks after someone, then our whole wall can be protected. It's not just the job of the church leader, the elders, house group leaders, or whatever. We can all be guardians of our precious people. But of course, there's the other side of it. Do we want to be watched over by someone else? We might regard those questions, should you be doing that, going there, talking like that, as rather interfering or intrusive. We'd rather remain private and not open up our lives to others. And therefore, if that attitude comes across, others then will be reluctant to challenge because they'll feel that they're going to get annoyed or offended. So for that to really work, everybody has got to want to be looked after by each other, even to invite it to happen, even to get together with someone and say, keep an eye on me, please. Yeah, and then I'll keep an eye on you. As part of that's to be part of the culture, if you like, of our church community. And of course, if things do go a bit wrong, because some people might really love this idea of challenging people and not to do it very well, then let's just try and be forgiving and learn to do it better rather than give up. Here's something that James wrote. My brothers, if one of you should wander from the truth and someone should bring him back, remember this. Whoever turns a sinner from the error of his way will save him from death and cover over a multitude of sins. Any one of us could wander. It happens. We've probably known this throughout our lives. And anyone can bring us back. If any one of you should wander and someone should bring you back, not call the elders, get the pastor out, but you can, if you're in the right relationship with them, if that friendship is strong, if you're together in the wall as living stones, you're built together with this person and that person, then you're the right person to make sure that that bit of the wall is strong. Someone who knows you well. So it could be just anyone, but anyone who cares enough is important. So that's for all of us, watchmen, guards, looking after our precious living stones. So what about gatekeepers? Well, they're more specific and they're more specialist, and they're not for everyone, at least not automatically. They need to be carefully chosen. And we find, for instance, in Nehemiah 11, verse 19, in one of these sort of long lists of names, which this is one of the big challenges of writing a book on Nehemiah. What do you do with these chapters where it's just name after name after name? And where you find commentators say these chapters are a nightmare and, can't go anywhere, can't get anything interesting out of them. Well, I did my best. But what we find here is that Nehemiah appoints gatekeepers. It's not just anyone. And we saw in chapter 7 that that's what he was then doing. In chapter 11 and verse 19, we've got some names and the fact that he appoints 172 such men. Now, at the time of their return, going back into chapter 7, in that other great list, I think it mentions, or I've counted, 138. But by the time the gates were back in place again and the whole city was functioning, Nehemiah obviously decided we needed to up this a little bit, and it's 172. Now, something I didn't say before is that if you're studying the book of Nehemiah, you really need a map of Jerusalem at the time. And in my book, there is a map of the wall with the gates, where they are meant to be, and so on. You just find it online. It's relatively easy. But it's really important, if you're studying any part of the Bible, that you find the right aids to help you. And so when I was looking at chapter 3, for instance, where all these different people repaired different bits, I felt I had to find what the map looked like at the time. But if you are searching for it, make sure you search for Jerusalem in the time of Nehemiah, the gates of Jerusalem at the time of Nehemiah, because you might get a different time period. But if you look at a map like that, you'll see there's about a dozen gates. Okay, they've got very fanciful names. You can probably think of some straight away. I know which ones you'll all think of. But some of you will remember the Sheep Gate and Watergate and things like that. These gates had names according to their purpose, really, their function, what would come in and out and what it's all about. So 172 for about a dozen gates. Does that seem sensible? Well, obviously, you don't want one person per gate, or even two or three. They would work in teams, large teams, and presumably in shifts as well. So it wasn't, if you like, the only thing that they did. And I sort of worked out that 172 was about 4 or 5% of the city's population. There's a sort of estimate as to how many people eventually went to live in Jerusalem. It wasn't everybody that was in the land. Some of them stayed in their villages. In fact, in an earlier part of Nehemiah, one of his tasks was to allocate people to live in the city. Some volunteered, that's where they wanted to be. Most didn't. Most preferred to live in their villages and look after their little patch of land and their livestock and so on, and then bring their produce to market into the city. So Nehemiah very sort of cleverly had to persuade some people to actually go and live in the city, because if there weren't the right number of people in the city, then the city wouldn't function very well. But that's a different part of the book, really. So of the city's population, 172, maybe just a small percentage of the city's population, carefully chosen. Now, of course, city gates, not like the front door to your house or the gates to your driveway, they were massive. You will have seen pictures of these, probably in films as much as anything else. They were very thick, they had to be. They were also very, very heavy, because they weren't just wood, they were often reinforced with sheets of metal. There was iron or brass attached to them. So you can't just say to a couple of people, could you go and open the gates there? Or could you go and close the gates? In Acts chapter 3, it talks about the beautiful gate of Herod's temple, and it required 20 men to shut it and secure it. 20. One gate. Obviously a big, important gate. And in fact, when you read about the doorkeepers of the temple in Chronicles, there seems to be well over 200 of them, with 6 guarding this gate and 4 there and so on. And presumably to say they were in shift work as well. And it was guard alongside guard. It was in teams. It's not a solitary occupation. So gates are essential to a city because without them, what's the point? Building a wall you can't go in and out of. But therefore they were places where the city was most vulnerable. And I say you're probably aware of some of the things that happened at the city gates. It was where the elders would sit, decisions would be made, produce was bought and sold, I think, meetings took place there, and so on. Prophets went and declared the word of God there. And you're probably very much aware of the story in Ruth, where Boaz met at the city gate to discuss Ruth's inheritance and becoming her kinsman redeemer and so on. And it says that 10 of the town elders joined them and witnessed this. So what's expected of a city gatekeeper? Well, as with the guards of the walls, one aspect would be to check if repairs were needed. Because after time, obviously, things can deteriorate. Are they still strong enough? How's the wood doing? Are the hinges working properly? The gates still close securely? So it's making sure that maintenance was done where necessary. It's also, of course, about opening and closing the gates at the right time. Times that were set in advance and were not allowed to vary for any reason. Citizens needed to know that when they could come and go, but also that if they were late, they couldn't get back in. They should be trusted, the gatekeepers need to be trusted that the gates would be closed and secured at dusk for the safety of everyone. And residents had a right to expect that would be done, and therefore gatekeepers need to be reliable and trustworthy. And also, of course, to keep an eye open for whoever was prowling around outside who might be wanting to get in should it not be secure enough. Gatekeepers also had to be ready to shut gates at a short notice if suddenly, in the middle of the day when the gates were open, there were enemies approaching. They need to be rapidly deployed for that purpose. This was one of the problems Nehemiah found when he'd come back later on, which we saw in chapter 13, found that lots of the things they'd said they were going to do weren't being done. One of them was that the gates were not being kept shut at the right time, and traders therefore were being allowed in on the Sabbath. And actually, Nehemiah was so angry that he fired the existing gatekeepers and replaced them with others. So, what are our gates? And in particular, for a church, first of all. Gates are our contact points with the outside world, which we have to have. We can't just be a holy huddle, can we? We have to engage with the world, but every time we do, every time we go outside the protection of our wall, every time we step out into the world in that sort of way, then there is a potential danger. And also, of course, the gateway is there so that other people can come in to our community and discover what the gospel is about and join the kingdom of God. But equally, our enemy is always going to be just outside our gates, corporately and personally, waiting to sneak in and bring disruption. It's a tricky balance. And I think one of the things about a gatekeeper that's needed in the spiritual sense for us is wisdom and discernment to know, if you like, when to open the gates, when to close them, what's allowed to happen, and so on. We've got to try and keep the Christian community healthy and free from hostility to avoid the enemy creeping in and creating problems. And as members of a Christian community, we do actually need to make sure we've got the right people in place. So who makes a good gatekeeper? This, as I said, is not for everyone. Who is best qualified to be a gatekeeper for a Christian community? And the answer, I believe, is those who guard their own personal gates. Who guard their own gates, then they're strong enough to guard the gates of all of us. So what does that mean, these personal gates? Well, you've all heard of John Bunyan, yeah? Yes. So if I said, what did he write? Everybody says Pilgrim's Progress. Anyone know anything else he wrote? There's at least 2 others, but we don't. I don't know that one. That's all, you know. He wrote one, I think, about grace abounding, something like that. But he wrote one called The Holy War. Okay, now, like Pilgrim's Progress, it's not an easy read unless it's been sort of modernized a little bit. But The Holy War is a bit like Pilgrim's Progress in that it's an allegory. But it describes a battle between Shaddai, guess who that is, and Diabolus, guess who that is. And this battle is centred on a town called Mansol, a town founded and built by Shaddai for his own delight and glory, intended for its maker alone, but Diabolus has laid siege to it in order to take it for himself. So what Bunyan is doing here is he's taking Mansol, a man, generally, and comparing him to a city which is going to be besieged, laid siege to, by God's enemy. And he says the walls of this human city are well built, but contain 5 gates. And he describes them as follows: the ear gate, the eye gate. Any more, do you think? What do you think that is? The mouth gate. There is the nose gate. And the feel gate, because these are the 5 senses. Okay? Now, after ear gate and eye gate, you may begin to think, mouth gate, nose gate, feel gate, and so on. But he takes our 5 senses, because those are our contact points with the world around us, and says this is where there is danger. Okay? Now, we need these gates. Without these senses, we couldn't live properly in the world, could we? We need to hear things, see things, and so on. I'll leave you to work out what the nose gate is all about. I don't know whether it's just about inhaling things that we shouldn't, breathing things in. But the mouth gate is interesting because it's not just what goes into the mouth, said Jesus, but what comes out, how we speak, what we say, what's in our heart, and so on. And I suppose the feel gate is what we put our hands to doing. It's sort of like that. In fact, I would add more. There's the feet gate as well, guarding where we go, and the heart gate as well. Biblically, you can extend this a little bit more. But what Bunyan has, I think, rather cleverly done, as I say, his books are not an easy read today, given his sort of old-fashioned language. But his point is very clear, that our contact points with the world is our places of greatest threat. They convey the world outside into the mind, and from there into the soul of a man. And it's outside these gates that the enemy encamps, waiting to bring harm and corruption, and so on. Now, I'm sure you've heard before about us, guarding our tongue, watching what we say, obviously being careful where we go, what we see, whether it's on screen or in real life, what we listen to. I could go on, I suppose, for ages and ages on these individually. But what I really want to do is talk about how the enemy encamps outside these and what are some of the tactics involved. By the way, Proverbs chapter 4 would be a good chapter to read sometime about things like guarding your heart and things like that. Part of the advice in Proverbs is to do this sort of thing. So what's our enemy like? How does he camp outside these gates? What's he up to, if you like? Now, if I said to you, what are our adversaries like, people come up with the phrase, the world, the flesh, and the devil, don't they? Have you heard that phrase? The world, the flesh, and the devil. It's not in the Bible, as such, in so many words, but it does seem to sum up pretty well what the Bible teaches. But really, there's just one main enemy, and if you like, the world and the flesh are his main weapons. But in that sense, they interact. They're all part of the enemy. So just quickly on 2 of these, let me be quite clear. The word flesh doesn't refer here just to our physical body. It's nothing to do with just what we're made of. It's not the material part of us. That's not our problem. When the Bible talks about flesh, it's the sinful nature within us, which is described by Paul with its cravings and desires, its capacity to create lustful thoughts and so on. It's our carnal ways. It's our passions and appetites that actually are the very opposite of what God desires for us. This is our flesh, if you like, is a very powerful weapon in the hand of the enemy because we want to go that way of the flesh. And in fact, equally, including in our flesh, is actually the mind which wants to go its own way and be self-satisfying, self-serving, and so on. So the idea of giving into the flesh is that we go for the latest cravings and fashions and so on, because we're very much into self-improvement these days, aren't we? And self-seeking and all the rest of it. So we want to listen to that. And that's why the enemy will encamp around our eyes and our ears, so that we listen and see the things that will do that. It's our inner desires that draw us away from God, that puts ourself on the throne of our life and tells us the only true God worth serving and worshipping is the self. Get that attitude installed, get that gate breached, and all sorts of seductive paths are created and easy to follow. What kind of gatekeepers needed here? Well, popular opinion will, of course, tell you to indulge, accommodate, and so on. The Bible tells us is that we have to crucify the flesh, which sounds brutal, but unless we put the flesh to death, it will always fight back. You can't just minimize it in that sense. The Bible tells us we do it by the Spirit. We sort of wage warfare on our carnal nature by the Spirit. Do not sow to the flesh by feeding what it wants, but sow to the Spirit. Keep walking in the Spirit. Basically, willpower is not enough. It might get you through Lent if you're not going to eat chocolate. You might just be able to get that far, but it will not overcome the stronger addictions or the power of fleshly desires. We need the Holy Spirit to help us shut that gate and guard it. The world will be telling us all the time to follow it, that sort of way, and feed that. We need to recognise that and take, if you like, a militant campaign against it. The world, again, it's a word that has many different meanings, but we're not talking about our physical world around us that God made and that's good. We're not talking about people, as in God so loved the world, everyone in it, and so on. People are not our enemy, although sometimes they give a very good impression of being that. But actually, where's our main struggle in Ephesians 6? Against the spiritual forces, the powers and principalities, and so on. And so this idea of the world being an enemy is referring to a system of practices and standards that are primarily anti-God. And I don't just mean godless, I don't just mean ungodly, I mean godless. It operates with man in charge without God in his thinking at all. It's more than just a social or political system, it's a whole anti-God thing that operates within the world, designed to eliminate God's rule and presence and to set up false and blasphemous alternatives. We call it worldliness. It's a network of values, morals, practices, all of which become integrated into the mainstream of life and institutionalized into a culture that is corrupted by the redefinition of good and evil. And the distorted becomes the normative, and it sets up its own wisdom, a wisdom that's not from God, but that is earthly, unspiritual, of the devil. James 3. So worldliness, this network of ideas and influences, is something that we need to shut our gates against. Difficult, isn't it? Difficult. And of course the enemy, main enemy himself, the devil, Jesus refers to him as the prince or ruler of this world, where the word used is one that's commonly used within the Roman world for a very high-ranking Roman official in a city or region, effectively the most powerful and influential person in that locality. So by calling him the prince of this world, or the ruler of this world, Jesus is emphasizing not just the magnitude of his power, but also its extent. No one can escape his reach or control, and the devil has held sway in the whole world throughout its entire existence and has been instrumental in how human thought and activity has developed over time in every area of life. So everyone that's now born into this world has got centuries and millennia of the devil's influence already there waiting to bring him down. It's the extent of the enemy's rule over the kingdoms of this world which makes it so powerful and such a threat. If you remember, the devil could tempt Jesus with the gift of these kingdoms of this world in return for his worship. And that was a true temptation. I mean, Jesus could cope with it, but if he didn't have that power and control, it wouldn't have been a temptation at all. And it's therefore the same temptation that he's going to bring to us. Wouldn't it be nice if you had your own kingdom? Wouldn't it be nice if you enjoyed the kingdom of this world here and there instead of the kingdom of God? That's the devil trying to get at us. Thankfully, Jesus has already pronounced judgment upon this world and its prince, but he does warn us, what good is it for a man to gain the whole world and yet forfeit his soul? That's how serious it is. So we have to guard our personal gates if we are to eventually help look after other people and the gates of our community. If we're going to identify those who are most vulnerable in these different ways, including the false teaching that's brought into the Christian world, the different standards that are brought in and so on. These are all the work of the enemy. But if you're going to be a gatekeeper, you have to be strongly resistant against them in your own life first. Otherwise, you're actually a channel for the enemy to use you in that. You'll be like a Tobiah influence, on the inside, influencing this. I will end with one more thing. I've probably got another 5-10 minutes. What is one of the main tactics or weapons, if you like, of the enemy? And that's lies. Remember what Jesus said about the devil? He is the father of lies. When he lies, he's speaking his native language, effectively. He's the origin of all that's fake and false in our world. From the beginning, he's never stopped telling lies. He generates them, plants them, nurtures them, watches over them until they change individuals, societies, and even nations. And every society on earth is now full of his weeds of deception and untruth, so much so that they're seen as normal. His lies have become the common currency of our fallen world and explain much of what's going on in it. Now, the devil, of course, communicates his lies in many ways. One of these is by speaking, or if you like, whispering into our ears, just like at the time of the first temptation to Adam and Eve. Listen to me, I'm saying this, try this, and so on. And how he actually speaks can vary. It might be through actual words, it might be through human voices, something heard out loud or internal. So watch out for when the devil speaks, because by his very nature it must be a lie of some kind. There's an old joke that sometimes goes around. How do you know he's lying? You might say of someone that you don't like. How do you know he's lying? It's easy, his lips are moving. Well, that's not really true of people, but it's certainly true of the devil. Anything he says is going to be a lie. But lies are not just spoken, they're also lived out by people, and these are the worst kind, because then they are seen by others. And when people start living out lies, they become doubly dangerous because they go through the eye gate as well as the ear gate. And what we see can become what we want. Because what we see, we tend to believe. And then we decide, well, that's okay. That seems normal, certainly seems fun. And so we want this too. See, in the Garden of Eden, Eve didn't just hear what the serpent said. She could actually see the tree that he was talking about and the fruit on it. I got a feeling that the serpent waited until she was near the tree, or certainly it was within in sight, before he started speaking to her about it. And it says, of course, that when she saw it, it became good and pleasing to the eye. And then the serpent was clever enough to talk to her once she had seen something. He waited till she was close enough to the tree before he began the conversation. And she says, we can't eat from the tree in the middle of the garden. Oh, you mean that one just there? That's right next to you. where you could so easily just take it if you want it. I think the enemy will always direct our eyes as well as whisper in our ears, because that creates new desires or intensifies existing ones. And we can't steal from a shop. Oh, you mean that one just there that you're looking through the window of, where you see lots of nice things you can't afford? Is that what you're saying you can't steal from? We can't have sex with anyone we're not married to. Oh, you mean like that attractive person you see every day at work or next door? That's the subtlety of it. And a dual attack on the ear and eye gates is very powerful. You need your best gatekeepers guarding these entrances to your life and soul. Now, another part of the tactic of our lying enemy is the half-truth. The half-truth. There's a problem with a half-truth. Can you guess what it is? It's the other half. Okay? The truthful bit is what makes it appealing. An out-and-out lie appears so ridiculous you just don't swallow it. But if part of it is true, then it carries the rest into our minds where it can settle and affect us. I wonder if you know this. How poisonous is rat poison? Anyone used rat poison? Have you ever read the package? Any idea how poisonous it is? Well, of course, the answer might be very, because it works. In fact, over 99.99% of rat poison is good stuff. It's what the rats like and will eat and won't harm them. The other 0.0025%, and for those of you whose maths need a bit of help here, that's 1 part in 40,000, just 1 part in 40,000 is poison. So how poisonous is rat poison? Hardly at all, or 100% deadly, depending how you look at it. Do you see the subtlety of that? Just one feed is all you need is a good advertising slogan when it comes to rat poison. But 1 part in 40,000, that's not very much. But it's deadly. It's deadly. Now, Christians are just as susceptible to half-truths as everybody else. New phrases and ideas that seem appealing or desirable, unchecked against biblical truth, and then they get passed on within the Christian world. They get accepted, repeated, and eventually assumed to be true, almost beyond criticism. And I should add, get sung about as well. Actually, watch out for that. Sometimes these ideas, these half-truths, get embedded in particular theologies, and out of that comes through in particular songs, although they don't represent God in any way. The word true is the same as the word real. So the problem about a lie is that it destroys reality. If a lie becomes truthful, it drives us into unreality. And the enemy isn't interested in just any old lies, any old things that are untrue. Some things don't bother us at all. But it's what will reshape our lives once they get into our hearts. These are the ones that he's most interested in. The ones that have got some emotional pulling power. See, certain lives may leave us unmoved. Okay, that just doesn't matter. But if we're told that this is what we really deserve, or this is what makes us happier, and so on, if it entices us in a certain way, then we'll be drawn into it. After all, our main obligation is always to self-satisfaction, and so on. And our enemy is very skillful at making us imagine something is true when it's actually false. Our capacity to believe a lie is astonishing at times. I'm not going to comment on recent political events. You can do that yourself. But when you believe your own lies, you're in trouble, aren't you? Our gates need to be guarded very securely against all these schemes. Now, I want to give you something positive at the end of all this. Paul talks about the armour of God. Remember that? If not, have a look at it. Is it Ephesians 6? Am I right? I've got that right? Correct me if I'm wrong. But probably you can list the armour of God, can you? If not, you ought to. You ought to be able to memorise it and list it. One of the items is the belt of truth. So I think it's the helmet of salvation, the breastplate of righteousness, all the way down to the feet. But there's the belt of truth firmly around our waist, holding everything together. And I'm not going to go into more detail now about false teaching and false prophets and so on, but we know that they're all there and they can only be combated with the belt of truth. I'd also just add this, though. Beware today of certain Bible translations which are coming out in order to bring half-truth stroke lies into our thinking and our traditional teaching, designed to support false teachers and false theology. Now, I'm not going to say any, people always ask me, which translation should we use? They've all got problems, they've all got faults. I don't recommend one. What I do recommend is check where a translation has come from and what its purpose is. And in particular, if it's from an individual rather than a committee. I know committees can be annoying and so on, but sometimes there's safety in a committee producing something than if it's an individual. And be aware whether they're saying it's a translation or a paraphrase or whatever. Be careful. Be careful what comes out in new Bibles. You might be aware of some that's been talked about even now. They're going to generate Bibles through AI. You heard that? Yeah, that is quite frightening. Yeah. And as I've said before, be careful about certain songs. Always think what it is you're singing. Songs can be tuneful, very rhythmical, doesn't mean they're scriptural. 3.5 verses can be fine. The other 2 lines can be where the error occurs. Whether they're deliberate, I don't know. Some songs, you think, why have they put that in there? Oh, well, because they needed a rhyme. Or it fits the meter, the rhythm. Or you can't leave the verse half written. You know, you've got to have the completion of the 4th verse or something. But of course, what we sing stays with us, doesn't it? And the music carries us into us. The music itself won't be the problem, it's the words that it carries into us. And one line of a song, or a few verses in a whole Bible, may not seem very much, but remember the rat poison. So being a gatekeeper is demanding, it's not for everyone, but you do have to guard your own personal gates, and that is an immense challenge for each of us. To be a gatekeeper requires one quality in particular that Nehemiah had to have, and I think he did have, and that's discernment. But the great thing is about discernment, we can ask God for it, just like we can ask God for wisdom and that sort of thing. We can learn to discern the truth from the lie. We can be trained to distinguish good from evil, and that's in Hebrews. But I'll end with a verse by Jesus for us, because it's in his prayer in John 17 for his disciples, where he says, "Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth." Amen. Have you? Good. I can talk now without being recorded.